Looks like it is about time for us to begin. We are in Matthew chapter 4, and we'll begin studying the ministry of Jesus. Before we do that, let's begin with a word of prayer. And Dave, would you lead us in that prayer?
Our dear Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Father, we're thankful for this time you've allowed us to assemble here this morning to study another portion of your word. Father, we pray that we will dismiss the cares and thoughts of this world, concentrate solely on your word, and take it into our hearts that we may learn it and use it to teach it to others. Father, we pray that you go through us for the rest of this study this morning. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. All right, we are in Matthew chapter 4, and we have been discussing over the last several weeks now the temptation of Christ in Matthew chapter 4. And remember that there have been so far a series of events that have taken place into the life of Jesus, and much of this is in preparation for what we're about to read beginning at verse 12, the ministry of Christ and the things that he begins to do as he goes out and performs miracles and works and begins to teach the coming of the kingdom. Before we get to that, I want you to notice the last verse of this temptation account there in verse number 11. Remember that Jesus was tempted 3 different times. Before that, he was tempted 40 days in the wilderness. During those 40 days, he had fasted. Afterward, he was hungry. The devil tempted him by saying, "Command these stones to become bread." Jesus was tempted by the devil, taking him up on top of this pinnacle of the temple and telling him, "Throw yourself down, because after all, you believe in the scriptures so much. The scriptures say that God will take care of you. Prove that you believe in them." And then he tempted him by, in a miraculous display, put him up on the top of this high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and said, "I'll give you all of this if you just bow down and worship me." And then after all of that, verse number 11, then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. I want you to go over to Luke's account because Luke is a little more descriptive about what happened. Luke chapter 4, let's notice what he says in verse number 12. Luke chapter 4, verse number 12. There it says, verse 13. Now when the devil had ended every temptation, he departed from him until an opportune time. Look at the phrase, now when the devil ended every temptation. The word ended is a word that literally means to come to complete perfection. And the concept is that the devil actually gave to Jesus every possible means of temptation. Here is the devil, and he threw everything that he had at Jesus. He tempted him in every single way possible, and when there is absolutely nothing left to give to him, that's when the devil then turned and walked away. And so he gave to him every temptation. He ended all these temptations, gave him everything that he had. But then it says he departed, and that word departed is a word that carries the idea of he went away feeling dejected. Now watch the word picture that's being painted for us. Here is the devil. He throws everything that he has at Jesus. He tries to tempt him in every way possible. In fact, we can read in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, that Jesus was tempted in all points. Well, here is the devil tempting him with everything that he had. And after failing to do what he wanted to do, the devil then turned and walked away, his head downcast, feeling dejected. He failed. Carl?
It says for a season. we're told to resist the devil, he'll flee from us. That's not going to be a one-time thing. It's going to be lurking around always.
That's right. That's a good point. And we're going to find also that as we study through the book of Matthew and all these other three accounts, we're going to find that the devil did leave him, but it wasn't for good. Because as Carl pointed out there at the end of verse number 13, he said that he departed from him until an opportune time. And so we can start seeing as Jesus begins his ministry that the devil tries to come after Jesus in a variety of ways. He does through the Pharisees and the scribes. He does so through the Jews. He does so through various temptations. And we're going to find that so often that there would be those that would confront Jesus, and Jesus would respond by saying, I'm not going to let the devil do this to me. Well, this was the devil that was involved in trying to confront Jesus. This was the devil that was doing that to him. Remember, in fact, when Peter had been told by Jesus that he was going to deny him 3 times, and remember that Peter responded in chapter 27 when he said, Lord, I would never do that. And remember how Jesus responded? Get behind me, Satan. This was Satan again trying to involve himself in trying to tempt Jesus. Remember when Judas had betrayed Jesus? That it says that Satan entered the heart of Judas. So, yes, it says in verse 13 that he departed from him, but he was not done with Jesus yet. And he was still going to come after him in a variety of different ways. So that's the temptation of Jesus in Matthew chapter 4. Is there any comments or questions that you have before we move on? Chuck?
We find in a study of his word that they tempted him, the lawyers, the Pharisees, Sadducees, everybody tempted him the entire ministry. So he wasn't just tempted during this period of time with the devil. It was a life situation.
That's right. His entire life he was tempted. From the moment that he came out of that wilderness, the entire life all the way up to his death, even while on the cross, he was tempted. As there would be those that would say, if you really are the Son of God, come off the cross and prove it to us. And so he was tempted throughout the entire life. Any other comments or questions? All right, let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 4. And we'll read starting at verse 12 and go down to verse 17. Matthew 4, 12 through 17. And Richard, would you read that for us?
Matthew 4, 12 through 17. Now when Jesus had heard that John was cast into prison, he departed into Galilee. And leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is upon the sea coast in the borders of Zebulun and I don't know how to say that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of the other one, by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, Galilee, and Gentiles. The people which sat in darkness saw a great light, and to them which sat in the region and the shadows of death, light is sprung up. From that time, Jesus began to preach and to say, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand.
All right. So we find Jesus beginning his ministry, verse number 17. From that time, Jesus began to preach. And so there is his beginning of his ministry. There were some difficult names. Unfortunately, you had to read them twice. Came up twice. But you did all right. That's what I usually do. Now, when I read this text, I find that there are 2 things. There is, first of all, in reference to the ministry of Christ, there is a time period. And then second of all, there is a location. There is a time and a place. Let's explore those things this morning. Verse number 12 begins, now when Jesus heard that John had been put in prison. Stop there. The ministry of Jesus is going to begin at the time, sometime after John is in prison. Now, we know that Jesus and John had interacted a number of times. We know that the disciples of Jesus and the disciples of John had been confronting each other a few times. And they'd even mentioned, by the way, all of this happened before John was in prison. But here we find John being put into prison as one of the marks of the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Now, why do you suppose John was put into prison? Do we know why?
Because Herod was mad at him.
That's pretty much it. That's right. Because Herod was angry at him. He was not happy with John. Why was he unhappy with John? What did he do?
He was questioning the marriage and divorce of his wife or the queen.
That's exactly right. He was challenging Herod and Herodias about their marriage. In fact, let's go ahead and look at a couple of passages to establish and flesh this concept out. Turn to Matthew chapter 14, and let's read verses 3 through 5. Matthew 14, verses 3 through 5. And Stacy, would you read that for us?
For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet.
All right. A couple of things we learn from this text. We learn, first of all, that you get the impression that Herod did not necessarily want to do this for himself, but he was more acting on the influence of Herodias. Because it says again in verse number 3 that it was for the sake of Herodias. Now, we also know that Herodias was his brother Philip's wife. And so Herodias was married to Herodias, and Herod was married to Philip's wife. Let's go ahead and look at Mark chapter 6, and we're going to see a little more detail here. Mark chapter 6. And let's read verses 14 down through 22. 14 down through 22. Michelle, would you read that for us?
Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said it is Elijah, and others said it is a prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, this is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, where he had married her. Because John had said to Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you.
All right, so we know that Herod had said, ask whatever you want, I'll give it to you. The daughter went to her mother, Herodias. Herodias said, ask for John the Baptist's head. And then Herod did just that, had John the Baptist killed. And we get the phrase, I want your head on a silver platter. Well, that's where this came from, because that's what happened. And so Herod's executioner went, took off John the Baptist's head and served it to Herodias on a platter. And so that's the account of John the Baptist being put into prison and eventually executed. We find in Matthew chapter 14 that it was his brother Philip's wife. We find in Mark chapter 6, verse number 17, that it says that his brother Philip's wife, for he married her. We also find that in Matthew's account and in Mark's account, verse number 18, for example, he said, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And so we know this. We know that Herodias was married to Philip, and then Herod was married to the daughter of Aretas, who was a king in a surrounding region. And then they divorced their respective spouses, and then they married each other. And here comes John, and he says, Herod, you can't do that. That is unlawful. And he rebuked him because of it. Well, they didn't like to hear that, and so they had John thrown in prison. There's some interesting things that I discovered when I looked into this. Let's think about the marriage of Herod and Herodias. We know that Herod the Great, is the one that we read about in Matthew chapter 2. He was the one that had all the children 2 years and under slaughtered, trying to get to Jesus. He had 3 sons. His 3 sons were Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. Those 3 sons. Of those 3 sons, he gave control or rule over the southern region of Israel, that would be Judea and then Samaria, to his brother Archelaus. He then gave Antipas control over Galilee, the northern kingdom. Having put them in charge of those regions, we know that Philip was one that really did not have a lot that was given to him. He was given control over some of the regions over in northern Syria, but that's just about it. But he had these 3 sons. He had Archelaus, Philip, and Antipas. When we read about Herod and his brother Philip's wife, we're reading about Antipas and Philip. These are the 2 that we're reading about. Now, what John had said was that it was not lawful for Herod to have Herodias, his brother's wife. Now, what would be wrong with Herod divorcing his wife and then marrying his brother's wife, Herodias? What would be wrong with that? Jerry?
Was his brother still alive?
His brother was still alive, that's right. And we're actually going to discover exactly what laws Herod had broken. Turn over, if you will, to Leviticus chapter 18. Leviticus chapter 18, and let's read verse number 6 beginning. If you read verses 6 all the way down to verse number 19, and that is the wrong one. I'm thinking of chapter 18. Leviticus 18, beginning at verse 6, and we read all the way down to verse number 18. You read about, for example, verse number 6, none of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am the Lord. And so it was, according to Jewish law, a sin to have any kind of romantic sexual relationship with anyone that was in your family. And that would be literally anyone. And he begins to list all these different relationships, from your mother to your father, to your son, to your daughter, nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles, and all these different relationships that were in there. And he said, you're not allowed to have a romantic sexual relationship with anyone that's in your family. Skip down to verse 16. 16 says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness. And so according to Old Testament Jewish law, it was wrong for a man to have a relationship with his brother's wife. Well, now wait a minute. But they divorced. And Herod divorced his wife, Herodias divorced Philip, and then they married each other. So they were not technically together anymore. Would it still be wrong? Yes. Because there's one other law they violated as well. Turn over to Deuteronomy chapter 25. Now, according to Jewish law, you could marry your brother's wife. But there was an exception to that. Jerry?
If the brothers passed away.
Yes, only if the brother passed away would that exception come into play and you no longer were banned from marrying your brother's wife. Let's read Deuteronomy 25 and let's read verses 5 through 10. Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 through 10. Joetta, would you read that for us?
If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brothers shall go in to her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man does not want to take his brother's wife, then let his brother's wife go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to raise up a name to his brother in Israel. He will not perform the duty of my husband's brother. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him. But if he stands firm and says, I do not want to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. And his name shall be called in Israel the house of him who has his sandal removed.
How would you like to have a name like that? The man whose sandal was removed. So here we find that if a man is married and he dies, his brother has responsibility of marrying the widow and thus carrying on the family name. And so it was unlawful for somebody to have his brother's wife because that would be an act of incest, according to Leviticus 18. But if the brother died, then that relationship was opened up and he could then marry his brother's wife and that relationship and that name can continue. Jerry?
What if that man's already married?
Well, that's probably not going to happen that way. Butch?
Well, it's covered by that because it gives laws back there for if a man had more than one wife. That's the circumstance in which he would have more than one. Is if he was
Right.
already married, his brother died without any children, he could also marry that woman.
Yes.
And that was under the law of God.
Yes, exactly. Good point. So we have the relationship of a man having then more than one wife. Kara?
Did it have any rules for who was supposed to do it? Did it automatically go to the oldest brother? Or what if there was a brother that was not married?
My understanding is that it would go to the oldest brother first and then go down from there. In fact, let's go ahead and look at another example of that. Turn to the New Testament book of Matthew, and let's read Matthew 22, verses 23 to 28. Matthew 22, 23 to 28. Now, remember that in this context, you read about the Sadducees who did not believe in the resurrection. And because they did not believe in the resurrection, they thought they could trip Jesus up by asking him about this marriage arrangement. Matthew 22, 23 through 28. And Sandy, would you read that?
The same day, the Sadducees who say that there is no resurrection and asked him, saying, Master, Moses says, if a man die and have no children, his brother shall marry his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were with us 7 brethren, and the first, he had married a wife, deceased, having no issue, left his wife unto his brother. Likewise the second also, and the third, and up unto the 7th. And last of all of them that died also. Therefore, the resurrection, whose wife shall be of the 7th, for they all have.
All right. So basically, they're asking the question hypothetically that if a man has a wife and he dies, the brother marries her, and they have no children, and that happens 7 times, then when the resurrection comes, well, she's been married to each one of these, so whose husband, whose wife is she? And of course, Jesus answers that by saying that in the resurrection, there is no marriage. And so the question is moot. And so what we find here is that Herod had married Herodias, and that would be an act of incest according to Leviticus 18, because he had not died yet. And so that relationship was unlawful. And so we're reading about a time in which John was put into prison because he had confronted John the Baptist, he had confronted Herod rather, about this unlawful marriage. Now I did some digging and I looked at Josephus, who wrote in his Antiquities, and remember that Josephus was a historian during that time period who recorded the events that took place in the life of Jesus and the surrounding regions. And I want you to listen to what Josephus had to say about this particular incident. He says, Herodias, taking it into her head to flout the way of our fathers, married Herod the Tetrarch, her husband's brother of the same father, who was the Tetrarch of Galilee. To do this, she departed from her living husband. And so he points out that the sin again was that she had departed from her husband and they got married at a time when her husband was still alive. Now, that's the time. Jesus was beginning his ministry when John the Baptist was in prison because he confronted the unlawful marriage of Herod and Herodias. Which?
For John, the book of John, chapter 3, verse 24, there's a phrase there that says, for John was not yet cast into prison. So what we read about in the first 3 chapters up to chapter 4 anyway, covers a lot of the life of Jesus. It took place before what we begin reading about there. He did miracles in Jerusalem. Nicodemus knew about it. There was a lot he did. He just hadn't officially began the ministry in Galilee. But he'd not been active, but he had disciples. As it says in verse 22 of John 3, him and his disciples came into the land of Judea, and he was with them. They were baptized into John's baptism, the same as John. But he wasn't yet active in Galilee until he went back there. And that took place after a lot of this. So when it says, then he began, from that time he began to preach, it's talking about an official thing when he began in Galilee. There's a lot he did before that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that out, because when we read the first 3 chapters of John, we read that Jesus did a lot of work and a lot of teaching and a lot of miracles. We know that he, as Butch pointed out, had disciples, and this all happened before John. But that's right. When it says in Matthew chapter 3, verse number 12, that verse 17 rather, that from that point on he began to preach, that was his official beginning of his ministry there in Galilee. But where was he before he was in Galilee? Well, he eventually got there, but he wasn't there yet. That's where we find the second observation here in this text, is that there was a time and that there was also a place. I want you to see where Jesus was during this time we read about in John chapter 3 and in the beginning chapters of Matthew that show us where he was before he began his ministry. Look again at Matthew 4, verse 12. Matthew 4, verse 12 says, "Now when Jesus heard that John had been put into prison, he departed to Galilee." Remember that Israel is divided up into three major sections. We have southern Israel, and that would be Judea. That would be where the capital city of Jerusalem is. Then we have the middle section, and that would be Samaria. And then we have the northern section, and that would be Galilee. And so we're reading about Jesus departing, and he's on his way up to the northern section, which is Galilee. Now, where was he before he departed? Well, go back to Luke chapter 4. Actually, stay in Matthew and back up to chapter 3, and I want you to see verse 13. Matthew 3, verse 13 says, "Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him." And so he was in Galilee, he left Galilee, and now he is down at the Jordan River to be baptized. When you study the life of Jesus, his early childhood and his birth, you'll find that he was in Galilee and he spent most of his childhood up there. But then when he became of age, that's when he left Galilee. He came down and we read about his baptism. Then we read about his temptation. And now turn to Luke chapter 4 and read verse number 9. Luke chapter 4, verse number 9. "Then he brought him to Jerusalem to set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, 'If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here.'" So he was in Galilee. He left Galilee, came down to the Jordan River, was baptized, and during his temptation period, one of the places where he was in Jerusalem. Now, if you're following Luke's account has things in a little bit of a different order. In Matthew's account, you have turn these stones into bread, you have in Jerusalem at the tabernacle, and then you have finally at the high mountain, showing them all the worlds and all the kingdoms. In Luke's account, it's a little bit different. You have stones turned into bread, you have up on the exceedingly high mountain, and then you have finally in Jerusalem. But when you look at the beginning of Luke, you'll find that Luke's intention when he wrote the gospel was to write an orderly account. Luke's account is more chronological, while Matthew's account is more topical. And so that's why when you study Matthew's account, you'll find that a lot of the things you find in Matthew are actually out of order, because his intention was not to write a chronological account, but simply to hit some of the highlights of the topics to prove that Jesus was the Son of God. And so in Luke's account, rather, the last thing Jesus was tempted with was to be in Jerusalem and to be up on that pinnacle of the temple. And so when we read in Matthew chapter 4, and we read about Jesus beginning his ministry, there in verse number 12, and we read that he went up from Galilee, the last place we know Jesus to be was in Jerusalem. So he went from Galilee, came down to Judea, was in Jerusalem, and now he goes back up to Galilee again. What's between Judea and Galilee? Samaria. That's why we go to John chapter 4, and we can read that while Jesus was in Judea, he makes his way up to Galilee, and somewhere along the way, he has to go through Samaria. And that's where we begin reading about Jesus and the woman at the well. Let's look at John chapter 3, and let's read John 3, 22 to 24. John chapter 3, 22 to 24. Actually, we already made note of that, but let's go ahead and read it again just to put some context into it. John 3, 22 to 24. Scott, would you read that for us?
After these things, Jesus and his disciples came to the land of Judea, and there he remained with them and baptized. Now John also was baptizing in Aenon near some of them, because there was much water there, and they came and were baptized. For John had not yet been thrown into prison.
All right. So of course we know that, as was pointed out earlier, that this was before Jesus began his ministry there in Matthew chapter 4, verse 12, and that there was a dispute among the disciples, and that there Jesus was down there in the Judea, Jerusalem area. Now skip over to chapter 4, and let's read chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3. And Thad, would you read that for us?
Therefore, learn how the Spirit gathered that he made and baptized more than John. So Jesus himself baptized not, but his disciples. And then Judea and Christ again together.
All right. So again, he's down in Judea. That's where he was baptized. That's where he had his temptations. And then leaves and he goes back up to Judea. And while he was going through Judea, verse 4 says that he had to go through Samaria. And that's where he meets up with a woman at the well, that Samaritan woman. Go back to Matthew chapter 4. Let's get more specific. He leaves Judea. He goes up to Galilee. Galilee was just a general region in the northern part of Israel. But look more specifically at where he went. He departed to Galilee, verse 12, verse 13, and leaving Nazareth. Where is Nazareth? It's in Galilee, that's right. What's the significance of Nazareth? That's where he was raised. That's his hometown. If you go back to Matthew chapter 1 and you read his birth, and you look at Luke chapter 1, 26 and 27, you'll find that Jesus' parents were in Nazareth. And in fact, it was in Nazareth where the angel had come to Mary and had announced to her about the coming birth of Jesus. So Nazareth is Jesus' hometown. Nazareth is where Jesus was raised, where his family brought him up. Then, from Nazareth, it says in verse 13, he came and dwelt in Capernaum. Where is Capernaum? That would also be in Galilee. Capernaum is the city that is about 30 miles north of Nazareth, and it's on the northwest coast of the Sea of Galilee. And so that's why you read, for example, in verse number 13, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. And so he goes up to Capernaum. And as you study Capernaum throughout the Gospels, you'll find that Capernaum was essentially the headquarters of Jesus. This was the city where Jesus set up shop. This was the city where Jesus would go back and forth. And in fact, you read many, many times throughout the gospel, so often Jesus would leave Capernaum and go here. And he would come back to Capernaum and he would do this and that. That was his headquarters. And so that was where he would launch many of his missionary journeys, from Capernaum. And then you read about another area. You read about, in verse 13, Zebulun and Naphtali. Zebulun and Naphtali in the first century was an area that at that point could not be accurately mapped, because the borders had become skewed and it became something that was a little bit disputed as to where those borders were. But we know that it was somewhere within the regions of Naphtali and Zebulun. And the significance of that location was that is what was prophesied by Isaiah the prophet. Remember that the purpose of the book of Matthew was to prove that Jesus was the Son of God by means of Old Testament prophecy. And so all through the book of Matthew, you're going to see references made to these Old Testament prophecies. And we're out of time.